The military has taken charge of the government. Generals are calling the shots. Soldiers are ruling the streets. Democratically elected leaders are in jail. People are protesting. They're demanding freedom, but they're getting bullets. What's happening in Myanmar is a coup. There is no doubt about it. But the United Nations Security Council, the world's highest body for international peace, is not calling it a coup. In its latest statement, the UNSC has condemned what's happening in Myanmar without describing it as a coup. Why? One report blames India, Russia, China and Vietnam for this. It says these countries insisted on the removal of any reference to a coup. So did India side with Russia and China in favor of Myanmar's generals? Come to think of it, what is India's position? Where does India stand on what's happening in Myanmar? What are India's calculations? How is Delhi walking the diplomatic tightrope in responding to the latest challenge in the neighbourhood? Tonight on Gravitas, we'll discuss that in our cover story. First, look at the statement from the United Nations Security Council. It came out yesterday. This is being called the strongest statement yet. It expresses, quote-unquote, deep concern about the detention of Aung San Suu Kyi and others. It condemns the violence against peaceful protesters. It calls on the military to exercise, quote-unquote, utmost restraint. It supports the democratic transition in Myanmar, but it doesn't call what's happening in Myanmar a coup. The question again is why? Why can't the Security Council call a spade a spade? Why can't they call it a coup? Because members of the Security Council did not agree with that description. One agency report says there was lack of consensus. It claims China, Russia, India and Vietnam suggested amendments and they pushed for the removal of the term coup. Sources in New Delhi say this report is misleading and that it does not reflect the reality. Look at this statement from last month now. It was made by the Indian representatives at the United Nations. Two quotes here are noteworthy. One, India said it was deeply concerned that the gains made by Myanmar on the path of democracy should not get undermined. Quote number two, as the largest democracy, India has been steadfast in its support for Myanmar's democratic transition. Since the coup on the 1st of February, India has issued several statements. Indian diplomats and lawmakers have spoken on Myanmar and they've all focused on three main points. Number one, India supports the restoration of democracy in this country. Number two, India calls for the release of the political detainees. And number three, India is concerned about the repatriation of Rohingya refugees. India has at no point supported the coup like some other countries have, and yet India has not called it a coup. What does one make of this? India's position is clear. It is committed to democracy, but it cannot afford to alienate the military. It must strike a balance, and this is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of pragmatism. We can give you reasons. Reason number one, there is a security dimension here. India shares a long land and sea border with Myanmar, more than 1,600 kilometers on land. India also shares a security relationship with Myanmar. It needs support from Myanmar to deal with insurgent groups in the northeast. Reason number two, India's investments, infrastructure projects that would connect India to ASEAN countries in the east. India cannot jeopardize them. The list includes the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway and the Kaladan multimodal transit transport network. There is also a plan for a special economic zone at the Sitwe deepwater port. Reports say around $1.7 billion have been spent in development partnership with Myanmar. India must protect these projects. And this is not just about money. There is more at stake here. There is the threat of growing Chinese influence. India's exit would be China's win. In recent years, Indian projects in Myanmar have been targeted by insurgent groups. In October last year, there were attacks near the Kaladan project. The Arakan army was behind these attacks. They were allegedly using Chinese weapons to target Indian assets. This must be avoided to secure long-term interests. India's infrastructure projects are an effective counter to China's growing influence. Isolating the military could force the generals of Myanmar to cozy up to Beijing. It will not overturn the coup. It would only damage India's interests in the region. India's relationship with Myanmar has been a long balancing act, in fact. In 1988, India had supported the protest groups led by Aung San Suu Kyi. But when the situation at the India-Myanmar border worsened, Delhi reached out to the military. In the mid-1990s, India and Myanmar launched joint operations against insurgents in the northeast. In the decades that followed, India remained in touch with the military establishment while pushing for a democratic transition. Then came a major step forward in the year 2017. A military agreement was signed between India and Myanmar. So far, they'd collaborated on counter-insurgency operations. With this agreement in 2017, the two countries agreed to train Myanmar's armed personnel in India. The relationship got a boost. Last year, New Delhi made another crucial outreach. India's Foreign Secretary and Army Chief made a joint visit to Myanmar. They met Aung San Suu Kyi. India's Army Chief held separate talks with the military establishment. 2020 saw a lot of progress. India also gifted a submarine to Myanmar. With this move, India was stepping up its defense engagement with the neighbour. This was significant because Myanmar's military chose to go with Indian defense equipment instead of Chinese. It was an attempt to reduce dependence on Beijing. Now, this has been a gradual coming together. The coup is going to be a challenge, but it should not become a roadblock. It should not be allowed to become a roadblock. It should not reverse the gains made so far, and yet the road ahead is not going to be easy for India here. Another major challenge awaits New Delhi on the 1st of April. That's when a virtual summit of the BIMSTEC will be held. BIMSTEC, as you know, is a regional grouping. Sri Lanka is hosting this virtual summit. India is its largest member. And it has invited Myanmar's new foreign minister to attend, the one appointed by the military junta. Will India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar share a stage with him? That would mean India giving legitimacy to the military takeover. We'll have to see. And as the world debates how to deal with Myanmar, the military crackdown continues. At least 8 more people have been shot dead. The death toll, we are told, has risen to 70 now. And we may not have the full measure of how bad the situation is. The military junta has removed insurgents from its list of terror groups. The Arakan Army, it's one of the most formidable rebel forces in Myanmar. It has been involved in ethnic wars in the Rakhine state. The designation of this outfit as a terror group has now been terminated. Why? To maintain peace. That's what the army generals say. It's humbug. A terror group has been co-opted in the name of maintaining peace, as police officials have a field day killing unarmed protesters. And India is not the only country to feel the repercussions of this crackdown. Even Thailand is preparing for an influx of refugees. Here's a report.
What you see are refugee shelters. They've been set up along Thailand's border with Myanmar. They will house refugees fleeing the crackdown. There's heavy security deployment. Soldiers, rangers, and health officials are at every corner. Thailand doesn't want to take any chances.
As a next-door neighbor, sharing a long common border with Myanmar, and Thai people having close interaction in many aspects, Thailand continues to follow developments in Myanmar with much concern. As with other countries, we are saddened by the loss of lives and sufferings of the people of Myanmar due to escalating violence in the country.
Back in Yangon, the crackdown is escalating. The protesters are fleeing bullets, carrying dead bodies along. The forces are sparing no one. This video is from a tea shop in Mandalay. As unwitting customers have their breakfast, security forces fire slingshots at the shop. What follows is a spree of destruction. In the city of Dawei, the situation is no better. The crackdown has reached the doors of protesters. Street battles have begun. The police comes armed with tear gas canisters. The protesters come prepared with buckets of water. Amid this turmoil, the army junta has taken a major step. It has delisted the Arakan Army from its list of terror groups. The army says the group no longer carries out terror attacks and will now help forces in maintaining law and order. Meanwhile, Aung San Suu Kyi continues to be in detention. Fresh charges of corruption have been filed against her. This time, she has been accused of accepting an illegal payment of $600,000 while in power. The accusations were leveled at a rare press conference held by the Myanmar army.
Former Yangon Regional Minister, Mr. Phyo Min Then, has revealed that he gave Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi the cash of $600,000 and 7 kilograms of Academy gold between December 2017 to March 2018.
These charges have done little to change the mind of protesters. They have vowed to come out on the streets every day with one slogan: the revolution must prevail. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
In August 2017, hundreds of thousands of Rohingyas arrived on the beaches of Bangladesh. Around 60% of them were children. They were fleeing what the United Nations later called a textbook example of genocide. Myanmar's military had burned Rohingya villages to the ground, separated and killed families, gang-raped women and girls, committed unspeakable atrocities. By September 2019, more than 1 lakh Rohingyas had fled Myanmar. This was only their latest exodus. As we speak, nearly 1.4 million Rohingyas are taking refuge in Bangladesh, 200,000 in Malaysia, 1,200 in Indonesia, 800 in Nepal, 650 in Sri Lanka, 560 in Japan and 50,000 in India. The world is carrying the weight of Myanmar's misdeeds, and now the world is bracing for another challenge. After a genocide, Myanmar has pulled off a coup. We just showed you what's happening in the country. The military is using battle weapons against civilians. It is giving terror groups a free run. Case in point, the Arakan Army, or the AA. It was placed on the list of terror groups in 2020. This was under the government of ousted State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar's military has now delisted the same Arakan Army. It poses no threat, says the military. The truth is, the military wants to use the terror army to terrorize civilians, quash the civil disobedience movement. They've already killed at least 70 people. The terror is far from over. And its threat is spreading beyond Myanmar's border. This country, Myanmar, is becoming a security nightmare for the region. It may sound like a sweeping statement. I will explain. Let me start with India. The coup in Myanmar has put India's border security at risk. India shares a 1,643-kilometer-long border, kinship, and a colonial history with Myanmar. While Myanmar burns, it is the Indian state of Mizoram that's hurting. There are sit-ins in Mizoram in support of Myanmar civilians. Reports say several Mizo village council authorities have even issued letters declaring their willingness to accommodate refugees. On the 24th of February, Mizoram's Chief Minister Zoramthanga assured the State Assembly that his government will be ready to assist refugees. It's an interesting history. The Chins of Myanmar are the ethnic brethren of India's Mizos and Kukis. The boiling of passion is understandable, but it's in conflict with New Delhi's stand. Like we told you, India has constructive engagements with the military junta. They work together in counter-terror operations. New Delhi is currently walking a geopolitical tightrope. A slight disbalance can threaten India's border security. Then we have Bangladesh. Look at the kind of trouble that Myanmar has put Dhaka in. It is now home to the world's biggest refugee camp. The Kutu Palong camp is one of the many Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. The country is supporting more than 1.4 million Rohingyas without much international aid. It recently spent $350 million to develop a sustainable shelter for Rohingyas in the Bhashanchar island. And just when Dhaka thought it had got a grip on the refugee crisis, the coup has sparked fears of a fresh exodus. And those who are already in Bangladesh are now all the more scared to go back. Next, we come to Thailand. Bangkok is calling the situation in Myanmar one of the quote-unquote most difficult political incidents in the neighbouring country. The coup has led to rising fears of a new wave of political asylum seekers in Thailand. The Bangkok Post reports that in the first week of March, more than 100 people from Myanmar sneaked into Thailand via various human smuggling routes. Let's look at ASEAN next. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Myanmar is a part of it. And it is now challenging the very relevance of this group. Foreign ministers from all of these countries held a meeting with the junta's new foreign minister. This happened on the 2nd of March. Brunei, the current chair of ASEAN, published a statement. We reiterated that the political stability of ASEAN member states is essential to achieving peaceful, stable and prosperous ASEAN community. Well, one day later, this happened. The deadliest day of Myanmar coup opposition, 38 people killed. A security threat does not always have to be a threat to life or territory. Do you know how the United States has described the Myanmar military coup? I'm quoting, extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Think about it. Why would a small country, thousands of miles away from Washington, be a security threat to the US? Because in Myanmar, it is democracy that is under attack. Myanmar's military coup has become a security threat to democracies around the world. The threat becomes even more serious when you consider Myanmar's geographical and diplomatic proximity to one northern neighbour, China, a country that seems to be justifying the coup by calling it a mere reshuffle. In 2020, China used the pandemic to impose authoritarianism in Hong Kong. As we speak, it is moving to vet the city-state's political candidates. Its neighbour followed suit. On the 1st of February, Myanmar's military staged a coup. It justified the takeover with an unproven assumption that the elections were rigged. It acted with surprising impunity. Fingers were pointing at China. Experts say Myanmar's junta could not have pulled any of this off without Beijing support. China's statements are only adding weight to this allegation. This is a period of worrying uncertainty. So far, Myanmar has sparked a refugee crisis, threatened border security, political stability. What else qualifies as a security threat? Well, here's another country in the neighbourhood. A few days ago, the world celebrated International Women's Day. There were calls for equal rights for women across the globe. But days after that, the same rights are being curbed in Afghanistan. Once again, schoolgirls have been banned from singing in public, a decree that reminds Afghan women of the oppressive Taliban regime. Here's a report.
It is the 21st century. Women are shattering glass ceilings. Calls for gender equality are growing louder. But it looks like Afghanistan is going back in time. An era reminiscent of Taliban's oppressive reign. It begins with a controversial order, one issued by Afghanistan's Education Ministry. It says that schoolgirls above the age of 12 can no longer sing publicly. They will only be allowed to sing at women-only events. If any men are present, they can no longer perform. And it is not just about singing publicly. Male singing teachers can no longer train them. Girls above the age of 12 will only be taught by women. This is applicable for all public and private schools. The decree even warns school principals of punishment if it is not followed in any of the provinces. The ministry defended this archaic move, saying that it was made after suggestions by students and parents. This decree has now sparked massive outrage in Afghanistan. Women from all over the country are slamming this order.
So if we want to have a good generation, at least coming generation to have good changes, so the key is education and schools. So when we are making some Taliban's rules applied on them, this is something that we are going to make time difficult and things more difficult, especially for women and for girls. And it's kind of, so at all, I'm really amazed with this.
The decree puts civil liberties of Afghan women at stake. For many, it is a traumatic flashback to the Taliban era. The Taliban rule was a dark period for Afghan women. Women were barred from leaving their homes. They could only step out under male guidance. Since the fall of the Taliban, women have made strides in all walks of life. In the last 2 decades, they have gone back to school, held important positions in the government, and comprise of 27% of the Afghan parliament. As the Afghan peace talks advance, the Taliban may return to power. Many fear this will mean a U-turn for the women of Afghanistan. For now, they are hoping for the best. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
India is planning a digital firewall against China. For months now, New Delhi has been dragging its feet. It has stopped short of banning Chinese telecom equipment, but now a new policy is in the works. It would make it harder for Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE to do business in India. India's Department of Telecommunications has made a few amendments. The licensing conditions have been changed. What does this entail? Indian telecom companies will have to consider, quote-unquote, defense and national security before buying equipment. They will be required to source from trusted telecom equipment sources, which basically means suppliers that India can trust. Now, this qualification is a result of something that happened last year. Last year, India's Cabinet Committee on Security, which is the final decision-making body on national security, issued a new directive. It called for telecom products to be classified under 2 categories, trusted and non-trusted. Now, the new rules kick in from the 15th of June, in fact. Once that happens, telecom companies will not be able to use any products that are labeled non-trusted. Chinese companies Huawei and ZTE are going to feel the pinch. If their gear is labeled non-trusted, no one will be able to use it. Huawei and ZTE have been accused of installing backdoors in their technology, vulnerabilities that might leave doors open for hackers to exploit. India's biggest telecom operators, including the state-run telecom companies, have all got equipment from Chinese vendors. So it's safe to say they will all have to think about dumping it. Curbs on Chinese technology is now becoming a necessity, especially after it emerged that Chinese hackers tried to target critical infrastructure in India using malware last year at the peak of the border standoff in Ladakh. Chinese hackers were linked to last year's blackout in Mumbai, the same blackout that had brought the entire city to a standstill. Reports say India is now planning to strengthen its cybersecurity with a new national strategy. And under this strategy, digitally connected government systems and India's nuclear power and aviation infrastructure will all be secured. Chinese hackers are becoming the next big national security threat for India. Just this week, we learned about the hack at Microsoft. At least 30,000 American organizations, including local governments, were hacked. According to a report, this is a Chinese cyber espionage campaign. Flaws in Microsoft's Exchange software were exploited. A cybersecurity news website said that emails were stolen and computers were infected with tools that let attackers take control of systems remotely. Listen to what the CEO of a prominent cybersecurity firm had to say about these cyber attacks.
We don't have rules of engagement in cyberspace. Modern nations don't have rules they're playing by. And what I just saw was China doing something they don't normally do. So that means they're expanding, they're incrementing what they are thinking is permissible. So we're going to have to define rules.
We don't have rules of engagement in cyberspace, he says. And in any case, China doesn't play by the rules. The threat is growing and countries around the world need to firm up their defenses. A ban on Chinese technology seems to be the starting point. It is the 11th of March. 10 years ago on this day, the world witnessed a disaster, the worst nuclear tragedy since Chernobyl. It happened in Japan. On the 11th of March 2011, Japan witnessed a threefold disaster. There was an earthquake measuring 9 on the Richter scale, one of the strongest on record. It triggered a tsunami that set off waves at least 17 meters high. They crashed into Japan's northeastern coast and caused a nuclear meltdown. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant was hit. 3 nuclear reactors at this plant broke down and spewed radiation far into land, sea and air. The tragedy busted the myth of absolute safety, a myth that nuclear power proponents had nurtured for decades. At least 120,000 homes were destroyed, more than 160,000 people had to flee, and almost 20,000 people did not survive. The sheer scale of the disaster stunned the world. It prompted an emergency review of nuclear energy policies. Several nations promised to decommission nuclear projects. Germany even embarked on an exit plan from nuclear energy. The last German reactor, we are told, will be powered down by 2022. But what about the rest of the world? The legacy of the disaster is alive in public consciousness, but it seems to have done very little to change our approach. The world is still exploring nuclear energy options. As I speak, about 50 countries are utilizing nuclear energy, and there are more than 440 nuclear power reactors. How secure are these? Can they withstand natural disasters? This report explores.
With a moment of silence, 1,000 people gathered in Tokyo to mark the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima tragedy. Japan's Emperor Naruhito led the prayers in honor of the dead. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga asked Japanese citizens not to let the lessons fade away.
I hope people in difficult situations will not be left behind, and that they will be able to return to their peaceful everyday lives as soon as possible.
We must never let the valuable lessons learned from the great sacrifices made in the disaster fade away.
284 kilometers away in Fukushima, locals are hopeful about the future, but worries still linger.
We have not recovered at all. There is still vacant land, so there is nothing to see in Fukushima prefecture. Only a few people have come back.
10 years since the catastrophe, this is what's left of the nuclear facilities in Fukushima. Devastated buildings, damaged ports, flooded fields, and a lot of radiation. The Japanese government has spent about $300 billion to rebuild the region. But its own figures reveal that only 15% of Fukushima's core area has been decontaminated. If Japan, a scientifically advanced country, could struggle with decontamination, one can hardly fathom what the situation would be in other parts of the world. Nuclear energy is still the world's second largest source of low-carbon power. It provides 10% of the world's electricity. There are 440 nuclear reactors in some 50 countries around the world, and 50 more nuclear reactors are under construction. Canada has 19 operable nuclear reactors that generate 15% of the country's electricity. The United States has 94 reactors that generate 20% of its electricity. The United Kingdom has 15 reactors that generate 16% of its electricity. In South Korea, 24 nuclear reactors account for 26% of the electricity. In Russia, 38 reactors are generating 20% of the electricity. 49 nuclear reactors in China are generating 5% of the country's electricity. 23 nuclear reactors in India are generating 3% of the electricity. And in France, just 56 nuclear reactors are generating 71% of the country's electricity. Scientists say that these power plants are the safest way to produce electricity, but meltdowns like the one in Chernobyl and Fukushima reveal just how vulnerable they are. The possibility of another catastrophe cannot be dismissed. In 2018, Greenpeace activists in France broke into a nuclear plant to illustrate its vulnerability. Lawmakers even declared that the plant could easily be accessed by terrorists. In the United States, nuclear plants are running out of ways to store highly radioactive waste. The site selected for dumping waste is the Yucca Mountain in Nevada. a place that is both volcanically and seismically active. In India, nuclear plants have operated safely during earthquakes. It is because most of them are in weak seismic zones, but they lie in coastal areas. They have never really been tested against a tsunami, except in 2004, when the Kalapakkam atomic reprocessing plant was flooded when a tsunami hit the Tamil Nadu coast. The Fukushima tragedy was a failure in acknowledging environmental risks. The tragedy is far from over for hundreds of thousands of Japanese people. What lessons have we learned? Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, another tragedy is unfolding daily. Forced conversion of minor Hindu girls. In the last 26 days, 3 minor girls have been abducted and converted to Islam in Pakistan. Aarti Meghwar, Reena Meghwar and Kavita Bai. 3 conversions in 26 days. The families of these girls are fighting for justice, but the Pakistani judiciary could not be bothered less. Let me tell you the story of Kavita. She is only 13 years old. On the 8th of March, she was kidnapped from her home. Her father says that 5 men dragged his daughter from their home and fled. She was then brought before a cleric who held a public conversion ceremony. Some old men gathered around her and formed a circle. They read some Islamic prayers as Kavita sat helpless in the middle. The images are disturbing, to say the least. You saw that. A 13-year-old is kidnapped, converted to Islam in broad daylight and then married to her abductor. What are Pakistani authorities doing? They say the girl claims to be more than 18 years old and has converted of her own free will. This is an excuse that we hear over and over and over again. Every time a minor girl is converted, Pakistan says she did so willfully. In August 2020, a 14-year-old Christian girl, Maria Shahbaz, was abducted and married in a similar fashion. What did the court call it? A matter of free will. In October 2020, a 13-year-old Christian girl, Arzu Raja, was abducted in broad daylight, converted to Islam and then married to her abductor. What did the court call it? A matter of free will. And let me tell you more about Arzu's case. We reported it. When the court hearing was held in Karachi, Arzu's mother was not even allowed inside the courtroom. She begged and she cried as the court made a mockery of the law. Watch this.
मिलने दे माँ को मिलने दे प्लीज माँ को मिलने दे प्लीज माँ को मिलने दे माँ को मिलने दे बच्ची को माँ को मिलने दे प्लीज माँ को मिलने दे बच्ची को आजू मम्मा के पास आना मम्मा
This is the life of minorities in Pakistan, a life bereft of basic human rights, an endless ordeal of indignity and humiliation. Pakistan's judiciary, its lawmakers, its government, its clerics and their followers, they all seem to be hand in glove as the minorities in the country continue to suffer. Is the United Kingdom staring at a breakup? Scotland is demanding a referendum, and that's old news. That happened after Brexit. And now a new survey has found that the demand for Welsh independence has record backing. Our next report tells you how the momentum for a split is growing.
Prince Charles, the heir apparent to the British throne, has the title Prince of Wales. But if a vote were to happen in Wales today, he might find it hard to keep that title. A recent poll has found that support for Welsh independence is at a record high. 39% of the respondents are in favour of leaving the United Kingdom. More than 50% feel that Wales has a different social attitude. 51% feel Wales is a historically separate nation. There are other reasons too. Several respondents are unhappy with the UK's pandemic response. They place greater trust in their local government. And more than 40% feel Wales will fare better if it leaves. The politicians seem unhappy with London too. Wales's First Minister Mark Drakeford recently said, "For the first time since devolution, we are dealing with a UK government which is aggressively unilateral." Almost a quarter of a century back, Wales had voted in favour of devolution or greater powers from the British government. But now the political movement for independence is gathering steam. One of the groups that wants an independent Wales has seen a big spike in membership. In the last 12 months, it has grown from less than 4,000 members to nearly 18,000. The growing support for independence is a warning for 10 Downing Street. Already, the British government is facing a demand for independence from Scotland. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon had ended the last year with a vow. Sturgeon plans to push for a second referendum if she is re-elected in May.
The independence case is a powerful one. More and more people in Scotland are being persuaded by it. And I believe passionately that it is one with the power to unite. An independent country where those of us who live here shape the future and work together to overcome our challenges will be good for all of us.
With citizens reeling from the cost of Brexit, the pandemic seems to have supercharged the calls for independence. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been criticised for his pandemic response. And the devolution of lockdown policy to the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has emboldened their populations. While those in favour of independence are still not in the majority, the support base both in Scotland and Wales is large enough to put the future of the United Kingdom at stake. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.